You ever find yourself in a situation that feels wrong? Like you've walked into a place where the very air is heavy with something you can't explain? That's exactly how I felt when I walked into that house. But if I'd known what was waiting for me, I never would have taken the job. I'm a recovering alcoholic, 8 months sober, but every day's a struggle. My sponsor, Greg, has been more than just a guide. He's been a lifeline. He knew I needed something to keep me busy, to keep my mind off the bottle, so he got me a gig with a friend who owns a house-sitting business. It's been 6 months now, and honestly, I've enjoyed it. There's something about stepping into someone else's life for a while, seeing how they live. It's like being in a movie, but the scenes change with each new house. This particular assignment seemed straightforward enough. The owners were going to be away for 3 weeks, and they needed someone to look after the place, feed and walk their dog, Buddy. I liked the sound of it. 3 weeks in a modern 3-story house on 10 acres of land, far from the noise of the city. It was isolated, sure, but peaceful. Buddy, a gentle beagle, was the perfect companion. Everything seemed ideal. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I'd walk Buddy, make dinner, and then do a quick check of the house before bed, making sure all the doors and windows were locked. Buddy had taken to sleeping on the bed with me, and I didn't mind. It was nice to have a bit of company. But on the third night, things changed. I was deep in sleep when a loud slam jolted me awake. Buddy was up too, his eyes fixed on the bedroom door. I always closed the door before bed, but now it was open, just a crack. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay calm. I grabbed the fire poker from the fireplace and quietly crept toward the door. The house was silent, too silent, as I stepped out into the hallway. As I walked down the second-floor hallway towards the stairs, something caught my eye, a shadow at the top of the stairs on the 3rd floor. My heart skipped a beat. The 3rd floor was entirely the master suite, and I hadn't been up there since I arrived. I forced myself to go up, but when I reached the top, there was nothing. There was no one in the room. I tried to shake it off, telling myself the door slamming was just the wind and the shadow. Well, maybe it was just my imagination, but the next day, things started to get weirder. I kept losing things. My phone, which I was sure I'd left on the kitchen counter, would end up on the living room coffee table. A knife I'd been using to chop vegetables, which was left on the kitchen counter for a second, it disappeared while my back was turned. I later found it in the fridge. It was like the house was playing tricks on me. That evening, I was sitting on the porch when I heard the radio switch on inside. I went in to find the portable radio in the kitchen playing classical music. I turned it off, but as I stood there, the TV in the living room flicked on by itself. Startled, I wondered if someone was messing with me. Was this some kind of prank? I unplugged the TV and the radio, determined not to be scared by a couple of faulty appliances. I decided to head to bed early, but I didn't bother with the TV this time. I unplugged it as well. The past few days had been strange enough without inviting more weirdness. I closed and locked the bedroom door. Buddy curled up beside me, and I switched off the bedside lamp. That night, I had the strangest, most disturbing dream. I was freezing cold, and somewhere in the distance I heard a child singing. The voice was eerie, almost mechanical, repeating the same haunting lullaby over and over.
In the dark, where shadows creep, I wander around while you sleep. In the night, so cold and deep, I'll find you soon, and secrets keep. Whisper soft, the winds that sigh. Close your eyes, don't ask why. In your dreams, I'll drift nearby, Hush now, child, don't you cry. Round and round the clock does spin. Time ticks out, the night grows thin. When you wake, I'll be within your deepest fears, where I begin. La, 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 the darkness hums. Wait for me, the terror comes. I'm the one you can't outrun. In your heart, I've just begun.
I woke up drenched in sweat, my body trembling. The room was cold, colder than it should have been. The bedroom door was wide open, and Buddy was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in as I rushed to the living room and found the front door and the kitchen door, both wide open. Buddy was sitting on the porch, staring out into the night, unnervingly calm. I slammed the doors shut, locked them, and checked the house again. Nothing was out of place, but the sense of unease was growing stronger. Later that afternoon, after taking Buddy for a walk, I was sitting in the kitchen when I heard a door creak somewhere in the house. I followed the sound and found a door ajar in the utility room, a door I hadn't noticed before. When I opened it, I saw a set of stairs leading down. My heart sank. It was the basement. Grabbing a flashlight, I descended the stairs and pulled the light switch. The basement was mostly empty, except for strange hooks on the walls and chains hanging on the side. That's when I heard it. A soft, eerie voice singing from the darkest corner of the room.
In the dark, where shadows creep, I wander around while you sleep.
I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand as I pointed it towards the sound. The beam revealed an ethereal figure, a small twisted figure that looked like a child, but it wasn't. It moved unnaturally, its limbs bent at grotesque angles. The face was the worst part, empty eye sockets where eyes should have been, and a lower jaw that was completely missing. It hobbled towards me, its ankle twisted at a sickening 90-degree angle. I bolted up the stairs, slamming and locking the door behind me. I grabbed my stuff and ran out of the house, but at the last second, I remembered Buddy. I dashed back, grabbed him, and we tore out of there, not stopping until I was miles away. I kept Buddy with me until the owners returned. When I met them at the agency to hand over the keys and Buddy, they seemed almost relieved to see me. I couldn't help myself. I had to ask, "Do you have a ghost in the house? A haunting, I mean." They exchanged a look that sent chills down my spine. Then they told me, ever since they moved in, strange things had been happening. They'd seen a mutilated little girl, heard a baby crying somewhere in the house, or shadows glimpsed from the corners of their eyes. But they weren't sure if it was ghosts or something worse. They did some research and found out that back in the 1600s, the house was part of a farm where slaves had lived and worked. The story went that the owner, a cruel man, had impregnated one of the slave women. When she became pregnant, he didn't want the child, didn't want his wife to find out. So he killed her, along with her 10-year-old daughter and anyone else who tried to stop him. The surviving slaves cursed the family and the land. They had offered the man, women, and child who had been murdered the opportunity to exact their revenge on the landowner and his family. Every last member of the man's bloodline died mysteriously, and the house had been haunted ever since. As they finished the story, the couple looked at me, a mix of guilt and fear in their eyes. "We didn't tell you because, well, we didn't want to scare you off. But now you've seen her too." As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that house wasn't done with me yet. And that lullaby, it's still in my head, whispering, singing. I can't escape it. Every time I close my eyes, I see that thing, and I hear its voice, promising that it'll find me again. And I believe it will. Since childhood, I had to keep a watchful eye on Josh. He was the kind of kid who couldn't resist picking up anything that caught his eye, pocketing it like some sort of magpie. There were countless times when I found myself having awkward conversations with store managers, police officers, or even friends, trying to explain away my son's habit. Kleptomania, they called it, a compulsion he just couldn't control. After numerous talks, endless scolding, and too many apologies to count, I accepted the harsh truth: my boy needed help. Seeing a psychologist helped, or at least I thought it did. Progress was slow, but I was hopeful. Then came the day when everything went wrong, when Josh's little habit brought something into our lives that I'm not sure will ever shake. We were at the funeral of a close friend, Jack. He was a collector, the kind of guy who filled every corner of his home with trinkets and artifacts from all over the world. His wife, Ellen, was holding the reception at their house, and in the chaos of grieving guests and whispered condolences, I lost track of Josh for just a moment. But that's all it took. Unbeknownst to anyone, Josh had wandered into Jack's office. The room was supposed to be locked, but in her distraction, Ellen had left it open for just a minute, long enough for Josh to slip inside. He was fascinated by the strange and beautiful things in that room, but one object caught his attention more than the others: a small, antique key with a skeletal head at the end. It was old, heavy, and unlike anything he'd seen before. It called to him, and despite everything we'd talked about, Josh slipped it into his pocket. We left the reception and went home. Josh didn't tell me what he'd done. Maybe he was ashamed, or maybe that key had a pull on him stronger than guilt. Either way, what happened next was beyond anything we could have imagined. That night, I was woken by the sound of a door creaking loudly. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too close. The sound was resounding around the room. A cold dread washed over me, and I lay there, paralyzed with fear, unable to move, barely able to breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, and just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the footsteps stopped and the room fell silent. The oppressive feeling lifted just as quickly, but before I could get out of bed, Josh burst into my room, his face pale and eyes wide with fear.
"Did you hear that?"
I whispered. He shook his head, but I could see the terror in his eyes. I jumped out of bed, slammed the door shut, and locked it. We barely slept after that, too afraid of the silence, too afraid of what might come next. The next day, we were both on edge, but I tried to brush it off. Kids have nightmares, right? And I was just stressed. We went about the day as usual, and I tried to put it all behind us. But that night was different. Josh was still scared and insisted on sleeping in my room. I agreed, anything to keep him close. A few hours later, I woke up shivering. The room grew cold, so cold, I grabbed the blanket and pulled it tighter around us. When I looked over at Josh, I saw that he was awake, his eyes fixed on the walk-in closet. The door was slightly ajar, and he was staring at it, completely transfixed. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint at first, but growing louder, more menacing, until it seemed to echo around the room. The closet door suddenly slammed open, and a freezing breeze hit us like a tidal wave. The same feeling of sheer terror washed over me, pinning me to the bed, my heart pounding as if it would burst out of my chest. Just as suddenly as it came, the presence vanished, leaving us shaken and terrified. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed a bag, packed a few things, and we were out the door. My sister Jenny was shocked to see us on her doorstep at 1 a.m, but she let us in without question. I explained what had been happening, and she agreed to let us stay for a few days. We researched online what could cause these sudden paranormal events, but we were even more confused. Josh and we eventually had to go back home. Jenny offered to stay with us for a few days to experience these paranormal activities. We all slept in my bed that night with Josh sandwiched in the middle. I had padlocked the closet door shut and locked the bedroom door as well. At 3 in the morning, we were woken up by the heavy footsteps and faint whispering. As the footsteps approached, the whispering got louder. It stopped in front of the bedroom door. The doorknob turned slowly. When the door did not open, the whole door started to shake. Suddenly, the padlocked closet door started to shake as well. The whispering was deafening. The room was freezing cold. It all lasted for a few minutes, but it felt longer. Jenny and I were hugging with Josh squashed in the middle, shaking in fear.
Is it over?
Jenny asked shakily. I didn't know. We stayed in bed for a few minutes before gingerly getting up. Jenny offered us her guest bedroom until we figured things out. She pointed out that we needed to find out the reason why this all started so abruptly. Even if we moved to a new house, we might still have the problem following us. A week later, Ellen came over to Jenny's. She had heard about the strange events plaguing us and wanted to help. She listened as I described the haunting occurrences, the whispers, the footsteps, the freezing cold. She looked pale as I spoke, then finally admitted that something similar had been happening to her over the last few months, until Jack's funeral. Jack had so many artifacts he had collected over the years. She didn't know what was causing these events. The night of the service, the noises had stopped, and her house had been silent ever since. She asked if we had taken anything from Jack's office. Everyone knew about Josh's kleptomania, and her eyes landed on him. He looked down, guilt written all over his face. Josh, I said, my voice trembling. What did you take? Reluctantly, Josh said a key with a skeletal head at the end. Ellen's face went white. I had a feeling, she said quietly, that key. Jack got this on his last trip to Egypt, but it's much older than anything he collected. I think it's connected to whatever's been haunting you. Ellen suggested we dispose of the key, get rid of it in a way that it could never be found again. We went home to get the key. The house was silent as we all made our way to Josh's room. He took the key out of his drawer and gave it to Ellen. She quickly shoved it into an old antique-looking box. Jack loved to tell Ellen the history of each item he collected. He had mentioned this box to her. A warded iron box that can seal cursed objects inside. When Ellen became aware of our predicament, she brought the box just in case her suspicion was right. We drove to Ebenbrook Bridge, a deep river running below. Without a word, Ellen tossed the key into the water, and we watched as it disappeared into the dark, churning current. Leaning on the railing, Ellen whispered, I wonder if Jack knew the key was the reason for the paranormal activities. What do you mean? I asked. You see, Jack loved to learn about the history of each artifact he collected. I wonder if he knew the key was cursed, and why didn't he put it in the box to seal it in? He died of a heart attack. I can't help but wonder if his obsession was the cause of his death, Ellen signed. That night, we slept like babies for the first time in weeks. Whatever curse had been attached to that key seemed to be gone. But Josh, he was in hot water, and I could only hope that the terror we'd experienced would finally put an end to his habit. But as I lay there, drifting off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder, what else had Jack collected over the years? And what other secrets had he left behind, waiting for someone like Josh to stumble upon? I'm not one for camping. Sure, the idea of getting away from it all, escaping the city, and spending time with nature sounds great in theory. But I've always been more of a watch nature documentaries on my couch kind of person. But Adam loves the outdoors, and when he surprised me with an RV trip deep into the mountains, just the two of us, I couldn't say no. I mean, how often does your partner plan a romantic getaway, right? The spot we found was perfect. Nestled between towering pines and a crystal clear lake, it was as if we had the entire world to ourselves. No other campers, no noise, just us and the wilderness. We planned 2 weeks of hiking, exploring caves, and taking in the beauty of the landscape. On our first night, we even made plans for a 3-day hike starting the next morning. Everything seemed perfect until it wasn't. Adam is a lot of things: a great cook, a caring partner, an amazing storyteller, but a navigator he is not. I realized that when we were a few hours into our hike and the trail started to look less like a trail and more like, well, nothing. He'd misread the map again. This wasn't the first time we'd gotten lost on one of our adventures, but this time it felt different. The forest was denser. The trees seemed to close in around us, and there was an eerie silence that hung in the air like a heavy fog. By the time we admitted to ourselves that we were lost, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Retracing our steps was out of the question. We'd have to spend the night out here, miles away from the safety of our RV. We set up camp at the base of a mountain, trying to make the best of it. Adam kept the mood light, talking about our first camping trips together, back when we were still dating. I tried to relax, but something was gnawing at me, an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. As I lay there, staring up at the clear, star-filled sky, something caught my eye. A movement at the edge of the clearing. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I realized it was a person. No, not a person. A figure, squatting on a branch, staring at us. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its clothes hung off its body in tattered strips. "Adam," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the figure. He followed my gaze and froze. "What is that?" he breathed, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, as if sensing our fear, the thing on the branch leaned forward, its jaw unhinging in an impossibly wide grin, and let out a shriek. It wasn't a scream or a howl, it was something unnatural, something that sent ice-cold fear down my spine. Before we could react, it leapt from the branch and disappeared into the forest, its shriek echoing through the trees. Adam grabbed his knife, his hand instinctively pushing me behind him, but the creature didn't come for us. It ran away, leaving us in shocked silence. We stayed awake the rest of the night, too terrified to sleep, expecting at any moment to hear that shriek again. When morning finally came, we packed up and practically ran back to the RV, constantly looking over our shoulders. But our troubles were far from over. That night, as we sat in the RV, trying to shake off the terror from the previous night, we saw them, shapes, moving between the trees surrounding our camp. At first, they were just shadows, but then we heard it, the same inhuman shriek from the night before, followed by another and another. Adam was reluctant to drive in the dark, especially after not sleeping the previous night. He reasoned that as long as they kept their distance, we'd be fine until dawn. But then, in the middle of the night, we woke up to find one of them inside the RV. It was perched on top of the cabinet, staring at us with those hollow eyes, its jaw slowly opening to let out that horrid shriek. But this time, it didn't leap or run away. It simply melted through the wall as if the solid structure of the RV meant nothing to it. "Nope," Adam mumbled as he jumped out of bed, the terror plain on his face. He started the engine, and we drove out of there, not caring where we ended up as long as it was far away from that place. The next day, we reached a small town on the outskirts of the mountains. Desperate for answers, we asked the locals about the strange figures we had seen. They exchanged nervous glances, muttering about old stories and local legends. But it wasn't until we visited the town's library that we uncovered the truth. Buried in the back of a dusty old book, we found the story of the lost souls of Black Pine. Decades ago, a group of miners and their families had settled in these mountains, hoping to strike it rich. But instead, they found something else, something that drove them mad. The townsfolk said they began to hear voices, whispers in the wind that grew louder each day. One by one they went insane, until the entire settlement was lost to the madness. Their bodies were never found, but the locals believe their spirits still haunt the mountains, searching for something they lost. And the shrieks, those were the final screams of the souls, trapped in eternal torment, reliving their last moments over and over again. Adam and I cut our trip short, eager to leave the mountains and those tortured spirits behind. But even now, safe at home, I can still hear those shrieks in my dreams, echoing through the dark, reminding me of the terror we escaped and the souls we left behind. You ever get that feeling that something's just off? Like, even before you see it, your gut knows that whatever's ahead is wrong, dangerous, even. That's how I felt that night. But if I'd known what was really going on, I never would have set foot in that mansion. My best friend Ryan and I had a bit of a thing for exploring abandoned properties. There's a weird thrill to sneaking into places that were once alive with people, now just empty shells of what they used to be. We found a few things to sell online, old trinkets, dusty antiques, stuff that people just left behind. The thrill was as much the hunt as it was the creepy, eerie vibe of these places. But that night was different. We'd heard about an old mansion on the edge of town. Used to belong to a drug lord who fled the country when the feds got too close. The guy disappeared, and no one ever found him or the fortune he supposedly left behind. Vandals had already torn the place apart, windows smashed, doors hanging off their hinges, anything of value long gone. But we figured we'd still check it out, maybe catch some cool footage, maybe even get a scare or two for fun. Ryan and I headed in with flashlights, sweeping through the dark, cold hallways. The place was huge, but the sense of abandonment made it feel almost hollow. Everything was trashed. Closets and drawers yanked open, old furniture overturned, the whole 9 yards. We were just about done when I got the bright idea to mess with Ryan. I found a room upstairs, probably the master bedroom. The bed was still there, but the mattress, man, it looked like it had been used as a toilet. No way was I getting under that thing. I saw a closet and figured that was my best bet. I wedged myself inside, leaving the door cracked just enough to see out, and waited. Ryan's flashlight beam danced around the room as he called out for me, completely unaware that I was just a few feet away, ready to scare the crap out of him. But before I could make my move, something cold and clammy clamped over my mouth. My blood ran ice cold as a finger pressed against my lips, mimicking a shh gesture. I could feel something standing behind me. Then I heard it, a soft whisper right in my ear. Shh. panic flooded my veins. I exploded out of that closet like a bat out of hell, screaming bloody murder. I didn't look back, didn't check on Ryan, nothing. I just ran. I ran through the mansion, down the stairs, out the front door, and straight to the car. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Ryan came up behind me a few minutes later, holding the camera I'd left on the windowsill. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and disappointment. "Really, man? If that's your best scare, you're losing your touch." I couldn't speak. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. When we were driving home, he looked over at me. "So, you're not even gonna ask if I was scared?" He smirked, waiting for me to admit I'd been pranking him. I turned to him slowly, feeling the blood drain from my face. "Didn't you see it?" Ryan's smirk faded. "See what? Come on, man, just drop it. The moment's over." "I'm serious," I whispered, my voice shaking. "When I was in that closet, something was in there with me." It covered my mouth and whispered in my ear. Ryan started to laugh, but stopped when he saw the terror in my eyes. "Dude, you serious?" I just nodded and turned to look out the window, not saying another word. The rest of the drive home was silent. When we got back, Ryan decided to go through the footage. I didn't want to watch it, but I had to know if I was going crazy. We watched the part where I burst out of the closet, leaving the door wide open behind me. The camera clearly showed a few tattered clothes hanging there, but no one else. Nothing was behind me. But that wasn't what sent the shivers down my spine. In one of the earlier recordings, as we were walking down the hallway, we caught something that should have never been there. At the very end of the corridor, on the ceiling, there was a figure. It was crouched on all fours, its head twisted in an unnatural angle, staring straight at us from the shadows. It looked like it was grinning. My breath hitched in my throat as we played the video again, watching in horror as the thing's head moved, tracking us as we walked. Then it started to crawl, slowly, deliberately, along the ceiling, its limbs bending like a lizard's, defying every law of nature. As we made our way toward the room where I'd later hide, it began to crawl down the walls, closer and closer to where we stood. Ryan and I didn't speak. We just sat there, staring at the screen, our hearts pounding in unison. We never went back to that mansion, but sometimes, late at night, I can still feel that cold hand on my mouth, hear that whisper in my ear, and every now and then, when I'm lying in bed, I see something moving in the shadows, something crawling across the ceiling, watching, waiting. Maybe it followed me home. Maybe it's still out there, in the dark, waiting for the right moment to come down from the walls. And maybe it's not done with us yet. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night and felt like something was watching you? I don't mean just a bad dream. I mean the bone-chilling certainty that something is there, lurking in the darkness, just waiting. When I was 16, I learned the hard way that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are all too real. This story isn't easy for me to tell, but if you're listening, maybe it's because you need to hear it. Maybe it's because what happened to me could happen to you too. I was a different person back then, angry and reckless. My dad had died in a car accident, and after that, life just fell apart. My mom moved us closer to my grandparents, hoping it would help, but all it did was make me more bitter. Money was tight, and I was on a path to self-destruction. My friends, Jake, Chris, Tony, and I, thought we were invincible. We did whatever we wanted, no matter who we hurt. And one night, We did something that we'd never forget, no matter how hard we tried. There was a teacher at our school, Mr. Harris. He was quiet, kind of a loner. We didn't know much about him, except for the rumors. His son had killed himself a couple of years before. Apparently, he was being bullied at school, but the bullies were never punished. Mr. Harris had never moved on. His son's room was left untouched, like a shrine to a life that ended too soon. We didn't care. All we saw was an easy target. That night, there was a PTA meeting at school. We knew Harris would be there. We broke into his house through the basement window, smashing it open and crawling inside like rats. It was dark and musty down there, but that only added to the thrill. We were on a mission to destroy, to vandalize, to make him feel as broken as we did. The living room was our first stop. Jake pulled out a can of spray paint and started tagging the walls, while Tony and Chris overturned furniture and smashed anything they could get their hands on. I joined in, throwing picture frames and ripping up cushions, feeling a sick satisfaction with every piece of destruction. We moved to the kitchen next, where we tossed food all over the floor, broke dishes, and poured milk over the counters. It was chaos, pure and simple, but we weren't done yet. Upstairs, we found the room. It was just like the rumors said, posters of rock bands on the walls, RPG games stacked neatly on shelves, and manga everywhere. It was eerie, like stepping into a time capsule. But instead of feeling pity, we felt a twisted urge to ruin it, to take what we wanted and leave the rest in shambles. Chris grabbed the kid's laptop. Tony took a pair of sneakers, vintage kicks that looked like they'd never been worn, and Jake pocketed some snacks and a few comic books. I went for the video games, stuffing them into my backpack without a second thought. We trashed the room before we left, turning it upside down, leaving nothing but a mess in our wake. The next day, Mr. Harris didn't show up to school, and we thought we'd gotten away with it. But that night, the nightmares started. It began with Jake. A month after the break-in, he came to school looking like hell, dark circles under his eyes, his face pale and gaunt. He was jumpy, twitchy, like something had rattled him deep inside. During lunch, he finally broke down. "I can't sleep," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Every night, I wake up at the same time, 2 a.m., and I can't move. There's this shadow in my room. It's always in the same corner, just standing there watching me." He continued. "Sometimes I would wake. I am lying on my side. I would feel a cold hand on my shoulder. It would slowly slide to my neck. I am unable to move or turn to see who is behind me. I could feel the hand tightening its grip around my neck. I am unable to scream. I would wake up the next morning, wondering if it was a nightmare, but it felt so real." We all stared at him, not knowing what to say. He continued, his voice getting lower as if he didn't want to be overheard. "At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but it's real. Last night, it moved. It glided across the room, slow and steady, like it had all the time in the world. It stopped at the foot of my bed and just stared. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was staring at me. The room was freezing cold, so cold I could see my breath. I blacked out." He omitted the part where he was so scared, he pissed himself and blacked out. "When I woke up, it was morning. He wasn't the only one. He wasn't the only one." Chris signed, ran his hand through his hair, then said quietly, his voice barely a whisper, "It's happening to me too. When I open my eyes, it's there, in the corner, just waiting, watching. I can't move, can't scream, can't do anything. It's like it's waiting for the right moment to." I don't know, to do something. I would wake up with bruises in my arms, chest, legs, and once I woke up in the middle of the night to find my usually mild-tempered dog on the bed growling at me for no reason before attacking me. I got 6 stitches on my arm. My dad gave the dog to my aunt. He did not have the heart to give it up for adoption. He did not believe me. He thinks I provoked the dog or did something to trigger the attack. Tony looked shaken, more than I'd ever seen him before. I keep hearing whispers all the time in my headset. It doesn't matter what I do. Change the headset, play without it. The whispers are still there, like they're inside my head. I can't even make out what they're saying, but they're always there, driving me insane. I can't sleep. When I'm in my room, I constantly feel like there is a presence behind me, but when I turn, there is no one. I stood up and looked at everyone. Is any one of you losing time? I would go to bed and wake up in strange places. Sometimes I lose track of time. I'll be playing a game, and the next thing I know, I'm somewhere else. I've woken up outside, barefoot in the mud, not remembering how I got there. That's when I realized it wasn't just bad dreams or paranoia. Whatever it was real, and it was coming for us. Ever since we'd taken that stuff from Harris's house, something had attached itself to us. Something that didn't belong in this world. We knew we had to do something, but returning the stuff was impossible. Mr. Harris had moved out, driven away by the cruelty we'd shown him. So we decided to destroy everything, hoping that would break the curse. We found a secluded spot behind the school, dug a hole, and threw all the stolen items into it. We poured gasoline over the pile and set it on fire, watching in silence as the flames consumed everything. But even after that, we still felt it. The presence was always there, just out of sight, watching us, waiting. We stopped hanging out together, too scared to continue the life of vandalism and destruction we once enjoyed. And one by one, we started to have accidents, freak occurrences that left us battered and bruised, as if something was still punishing us, long after the fire had gone out. For me, the consequences came a few weeks later. The police showed up at school, took me to the station, and charged me with destruction of public property. I had no memory of it, but they had CCTV footage showing me spray painting graffiti inside a church, on the pews, on gravestones, and the exterior walls. The footage didn't lie, but I had no recollection of any of it. I was sent to juvenile detention, and that's when the blackout stopped. The spirit, if that's what it was, had gotten its vengeance. It had taken control of me, made me do things I couldn't remember, and when it was satisfied, it left me. But the damage was done. I've turned my life around since then, but I've never forgotten what happened. I've never forgotten the shadow, the whispers, the cold that seeped into my bones at night. And sometimes, even now, I wake up in the middle of the night and feel like something is watching me. I tell myself it's just a memory, just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I know better. If you've ever felt that same chill, that same creeping dread in the darkness, I hope you never find out what's behind it. Because once you do, there's no going back. The shadows are always there, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when they do, you'll never be the same again.